Hello, my name is Shaniqua, and I was just going to go ahead and give my take on the chapters that we were reading in terms of The Gift of Therapy by Yalom. And my chapters were the therapist's transparency and universality. The things that stood out for me in this chapter were how clients may feel alone initially, then having that feeling being slowly removed because of other group members sharing similar experiences. I experienced this at the Counseling Center of Illinois. One of the newer interns had an idea that he would put all the chairs in a circle so that the group members could look at each other. And this small technique alone prompted several of the group members to share that they didn't feel so isolated by being in a circle, looking at their fellow group members and sharing their similar stories. Something else that stood out in this chapter for me, when it talks about the therapist revealing that she had been to therapy herself, kind of normalizes and gets rid of negative stigma of seeing a counselor. I do agree with this, although I haven't had the opportunity to share my therapy experiences with any clients yet. However, I do find in my personal life at home, I notice that when I tell people I'm working on my degree in counseling, I often hear a stigma that comes associated with being in therapy. And I assure them that I am not a wizard and that I cannot make their problems magically disappear. But I comfort them and let them know that I myself have been through therapy, so I understand what it's like to just need someone to talk to and need to get all of that garbage out in order to operate correctly. It's kind of like a car. You got to clean the engine, you got to get the oil changed, and you have to make sure that it's not just a shiny car wash, but you got to get all that mess out. And I find that when I talk to them and let them know that that's what I went through, comparing my situation to a car, their guards drop a little bit. So I do agree with this part of the chapter where it says, that the therapist had revealed that she herself had been through therapy. I also explained to them that I myself have had the honor of seeing a personal therapist, so I simplify the thought of therapy by letting them know that everyone needs someone to talk to from time to time. And like I said, that lets their guards down. One of my other chapters was Patients Will Resist Disclosure. This chapter brings up the idea that clients expect the counselor to know everything, which is to be omniscient. And this idea is refuted in the chapter on Avoid the Crooked Cure, when the patient dreamed about how the therapist ran into a brick wall with the client, which I'll talk about when it comes to the crooked cure. But I guess I could kind of do two in one as far as the patients will resist disclosure and the crooked cure, because I appreciate the chapter on the crooked cure because I wrote down the actual dream that the young lady had, and it says that the patient dreamed about tornadoes and that the counselor rescued her. And once the counselor rescued her from the tornado, they still ran into a brick wall. This basically lets me know, from my point of view, that the client now knows that we're in this together. So even though we may be fighting a major storm and we may be running away from something catastrophic, trauma that the client has been experiencing, or something that the trauma is going through that she needs to get away from to grow, the dream of running into the brick wall after being rescued from the tornado, it means a lot to me. And also one of the chapters that I found stood out in the chapter on Patients Will Resist Disclosure is that the counselor should always be dependable. I do agree on that. At my new practicum site, Above and Beyond, I was told that even if I cannot necessarily make a session with the client, that there would be another counselor available. So even though a counselor may not always be available for that client, I think it's good to have someone else that's able to deal with the client, which is why case notes are very important, and communication between colleagues is very important. Something else that stood out in this chapter for me in respects to patients will resist disclosure is the fact that they think that we should be imperishable. This word makes me think about the thought of self-care, how I would have to be able to take care of myself first. Because even though I am not imperishable and I am human, my chances of being able to be there for a client and be dependable would be based on my ability to self-care. So eating correctly, exercising right, bringing food, reading, and being human, but knowing that I'm also have to be there for another human. So it kind of doubles the load a little bit, which is why I love counseling. One of the other chapters that stood out to me in respects to the chapter on patients will resist disclosure is one of the patients, she was sharing how she had many accounts with undependable men and she had many deaths in her family. I kind of thought I would go into my personal story on many accounts with undependable men, but as I make the video, I don't know that that would be so appropriate, but I do relate to going through things and a client and being able to help a client that has not really had that male figure in her life, considering I just lost my father and he was not ever really there. I can definitely see how constantly running into men who are portrayed to be the breadwinners and they're portrayed to be the caretakers, to constantly be let down by them, I imagine can cause some type of feelings inside of a person, which would need to be addressed. Avoid the crooked cure. So this is one of my favorite chapters because as we just spoke previously, we talked about the counselor who led the client from the tornado, and they still ran into a brick wall. I believe this client had 2 dreams, I'm almost for certain, and the other dream that she had that I really enjoyed was how she and the client and the counselor were taking an exam, and none of them knew the answers. I really loved this chapter on the crooked cure because just like me being able to rescue my client from a tornado and we still ran into a brick wall together, we did this together, we fought this together, we tried this together, we experienced not being able to go any farther, hence the brick wall, together. So it's constantly this journey that we're taking together. So I love this chapter on Avoid the Crooked Cure because it also ties in with my theory of person-centered. I'm a really big fan of person-centered theory, which is kind of like the blank screen approach and letting the client know that I am not the professional and I am not that I'm the professional, but that I am not the wizard, which I love it talks about in this chapter. I am not the wizard. I'm not the professional on your life. You're the professional in your life. I'm a professional in my field, but not on your life. And so I really love this chapter because when she examined and neither of them knew the answers, I was like, oh my God, this really supports my favorite theory, one of my favorite theories, which is person-centered theory, because it supports the notion that I am not the expert. So there's a test, but I don't know the answers. I mean, you have to know the answers to the test in order to pass the test. So I really did appreciate this chapter on Avoid the Crooked Cure, hence the 2 dreams of being led from the tornado to the brick wall together with the client and not knowing the answers for the client. I really did appreciate this chapter. One of my final chapters, or my final 2 chapters was on taking the patient further than I have gone. And I really appreciated this chapter in terms of addressing the idea that a client has to deal with their own neurotic issues in order to fully help the client deal with their neurotic issues, which I disagree with. And the quickest way I can sum that up is it's kind of like a load of dirty laundry. My closet may be full of dirty laundry, which is not a good thing. However, if my client brings a bag of dirty laundry into my office, I can clearly see that this is a bag of dirty laundry. I can clearly know that this bag needs to go to the laundromat. I don't have to have my closet of laundry fully washed and smelling Febreze clean just to identify and be able to help this client get to the laundromat and wash their clothes. That's just the best way I can kind of sum up that idea in terms of the client or the counselor having to deal with their neurotic issues in order to help a client with their potential neurotic issues. So my take on that is that the counselor can still have their own issues and be helpful. I also found it interesting that that neuroticism, as I researched it, is one of the big 5 high personality traits in the study of psychology. And it was suggested that clients who score high on neuroticism are moodier than the average person, experience anxiety, fear, worry, anger, frustration, jealousy, envy, guilt, depressed mood, and loneliness more than others. This kind of took me to the DSM-5 in terms of a lot of these traits are normal. I mean, being frustrated can be normal. Being jealous can be normal, although it's considered one of the 7 sins. And envious and guilt and depressed mood and loneliness and fear and worry. These are all normal, except for when they go to the extreme. So I found that to be interesting, that they classified some very basic normal human instincts to be neuroticism. So I would have to see, well, how often is my client experiencing this and how much is it really truly affecting their life? And like I said, I don't agree that the counselor needs to be free of any or all of these in order to help the client. The best way I can also describe that is, like, for instance, the Johari's window. This chapter made me think about the Johari's window when it mentioned blind spots. Johari's window is basically a technique that's designed to help the client better understand themselves. It was created by psychologists Joseph Luft and Harry Ingham, and they use it in self-help groups as well as in corporate settings as a heuristic exercise. And the Johari window is basically comprised of the open space, which is known to myself and others, the hidden area, which is known to myself but not known to others, the unknown area, which is unknown to myself and also unknown to others, and then the blind spot, which is not known to myself but known to others. I appreciate this chapter because the chapter points out that the therapist removing what the client perceives to be an obstacle so that the client can move forward and grow is supported by Johari's window in terms of the therapist being able to deal with what the client is dealing with in their blind spot and not necessarily being aware of their own blind spot. I also feel like the Johari window supports the client being able to deal with a patient's neuroticism and not necessarily having to deal with their neuroticism at the time. Because the blind spot is only recognizable by the client, is only unrecognizable by the client. I'll say that again. The blind spot, in respect to the Johari's window, is unrecognizable by the client, but a trained outside eye, hence a counselor, would be able to address what the client may not notice. So I really appreciated how the chapters mix in with each other, and when I read them, a lot of them made sense and they could flow over into the next chapter. I also found it interesting that sometimes a professional in the helping world is not immune from portraying the outside image of professionalism on the public, but be extremely unprofessional in one's personal life. This can apply to me because in the counseling field, I listen very well to my clients. I'm very attentive. I'm very empathetic. But in my personal life, I really don't have time for the crap. So whereas I could listen to a client for 50 minutes, in my professional world, at home, I may give you 10 seconds to say what you need to say because I'm not going to let you fill my head with mess. My final chapter was on being